Welcome to session number 35 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. Each thinker that we look at this time, we're doing Lewis Carroll or Charles Dodgson, and focusing mostly on the Alice stuff, although I did bring his. I'm not going to bore you with symbolic logic and the game of logic. We're not going to do any exercises, but he's kind of an interesting guy in that sense. What we do in this is we talk a little bit about biography and an awful lot about world building when there is a world that's being built, and then philosophical themes. We usually have a lot of discussion going on during these sessions. We often go to the point where the library is about ready to kick us out, but we'll see how far we go with Alice in Wonderland. So welcome to everybody who's here. I'm glad to see some new faces. I've got two things for you. One, and I apologize for the small print. You can tell I printed it out at work, and things came out a little bit smaller than I'd intended. So if you're like me, it's a little hard to read. But there's a timeline that we usually have with things that happen to the person, and then their books on the other side. And then I've got a bunch of passages that I thought would be interesting to reference. Lewis Carroll, is a pen name. The real guy, his name is Charles Dodgson, and I noticed I actually misspelled his name. In these, added an extra E, but he probably wouldn't care about that all that much, or he'd make a joke about it. Somebody who's entirely in the 19th century. You notice that he dies shortly before the turn of the century. It would be interesting if he'd lived longer and got to actually see what people were making of the new century. And if he was around today and saw all of the things that have been done with his works and how much influence he's exercised on so many different writers and thinkers, I think he would be probably gratified, but also surprised. It'd be interesting to see what he'd make of like Disney turning Alice in Wonderland into a cartoon, wouldn't it? So, what do you want to? Should we switch it up here at all and talk about the world, or should we go through the biography as we usually do first? What are your feelings since we have a old and new crowd?
That'd be fun to go through the biography. I forgot that he did logic.
Oh yeah. He and I I read the Alice books when I was a kid. When I was in undergraduate, I was a math and philosophy major, so I found his symbolic logic book at Half Price Books here in Brookfield, and worked my way through it. And it was done in a very different style than the other logic stuff that I was studying, because he had his own notation. But it was a lot of fun. It was quite cool. He turned logic into something like a game that you could play with counters, and I think he's quite a good teacher. Apparently, he didn't really like teaching much, but he did it as sort of a chore. So let's jump in. So his mother and father live in this area. It's kind of a country place in England, Daresbury, and he's born there. He's the third child of a whole brood that's going to be born, and then eventually they relocate to Croft-on-Tees, which is sort of a residence. His father's a parson, so he is living in, I guess you'd say, a rectory. They're part of the Church of England, and for most of his childhood, he's actually homeschooled. Apparently, he was very brilliant, devoured books. They let him read what he wanted to read, and then there wasn't an awful lot of great attention paid to things because he could manage things. And then he goes to rugby, and rugby was one of the oldest. Now I always get private and public mixed up with the Brits.
Public schools, private schools.
Yeah, so I think it's one of the oldest public schools. And apparently bullying was a really big problem there, and he wasn't bullied so much, but he got in a lot of fights defending younger kids who were being bullied. They said that he had to use his fists quite often, so he wasn't really happy about that. Leaves rugby, and then he's ready to go to university. So he enrolls at the University of Oxford in Christ Church College, and it takes about there's some mix-ups. It takes a while before he can actually get rooms there. So he's entered in college, but he's not actually there at the college until there's some rooms available. And he gets there, and almost immediately after that, he gets word, got to go back home. His mother is dying, and she dies of inflammation of the brain before he can get there. And he goes back to college. Doesn't take him long. He doesn't go for a full 4 years. He graduates with his bachelor's. He was studying both mathematics and classics. Mathematics was where he particularly excelled. And then shortly after that, he's awarded a lectureship, which means that now he's got teaching obligations. And he spent a good portion of his career teaching undergraduates, the basic classes in mathematics. He doesn't appear to have enjoyed it an awful lot, but I can understand that. I get to teach things that I find very exciting, and I often manage to get my students to find it halfway exciting in philosophy, right? If at least half the class is excited half the time, that's probably pretty good. I think math is a bit of a harder sell. All of you can confirm this. You all had math classes. Some of you may have done some things with that. He starts using the name Lewis Carroll fairly early on, and the same year that he does that and starts writing little bits and pieces of things, he also gets his first camera. And Carroll, and this is a sort of controversial thing that we'll get into in just a moment, but Carroll was a big photographer, and it was actually a great way to meet famous people because you could offer to take their photograph, which was kind of a big production at the time, and then they would hang out with you. So he used that to get to meet a lot of people. He also took a lot of photographs of children, and there have been rumors that he was attracted to children, in part because some of them, the children are nude. Usually, as far as we can tell, the parents were there, present during it, gave permission. And there's been a lot of back and forth really since the 90s when I was looking into this about where did his attractions lie. It's clear that he had lady friends. So he wasn't, if he was interested in children, he certainly also had a not necessarily sexual relations, but partly romantic relations on the side. He carried on a great deal of correspondence and arranged to have dinners and things like that, which who knows exactly what that meant back then.
Have his letters been saved and stored somewhere, like
yes?
Tolkien and
Well, that I don't know where the archive is, but his letters not only have been saved and archived, he created a classification system for his letters. He was really insistent that he writes this book. When was that?
Jump ahead. I was
No,
curious about the background.
So he writes this thing, 8 or 9 wise words about letter writing, sort of close to the end of his life. But in it, one of the chapters is specifically on how you ought to. I forget exactly the title, but it's like you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't classify and track all your letters. Because what if one of your friends says, well, in a letter 3 weeks ago you said blah, 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 and you think that you didn't say that. Well, you know exactly where that letter is. So he thought that what you should do, and he followed this himself, is for each letter that you write, you have to put it in an entry into this log. Who the letter went to, when it went, what the subject matter of the letter is. I mean, nowadays people, I guess, would put that into a spreadsheet, and he was
just photocopy the letters too.
Sure, yeah.
But he didn't make extra copies of his eloquent letters. The full context. No. Okay.
Yeah, well, I don't know if he did or didn't. I don't know that much about it because I wasn't that interested, other than noting the fact that he seemed to be very particular about when ought to do this. He's suggesting that as advice to all of us, by the way. He's not just saying that he should do that. All of us, when we write letters, we should keep track of them. Now, how many of us write letters?
That sounds like a teacher.
Well, I don't know. As a teacher, I can't picture too many of my peers doing that.
It just sounds like something you would ask your students to do, like to keep track of all your homework.
Oh, yeah. Totally off topic. My uncle Hubert, he was a great uncle, actually. He only had a 6th grade education, but he was one of the best educated men that I knew because he read all the time in his spare time. And he was very interested in learning things about science and then about geography. And he actually tracked we have these notebooks at home. He tracked all the books that he read, and he would write a little note about it. Sometimes he was a little prudish, so like too much sex in this book, good plot, characters are weak, I don't know if he ever reread books, but he tracked all these things, and then he also did that with movies too. He would I guess go to a movie or see one on TV, and he'd write down what he thought about it. And he put it into just like a little spiral notebook, and
That's kind of neat.
yeah. I mean, I like reading through it. Yeah, I mean, and it's not like they're very long entries, but it's more than I think most of us do.
Well, and I think sometimes for some people, maybe many people, the
Yeah.
act of writing or highlighting text sort of re-cements it in your memory.
Yeah,
So just, even if you never go back and look at it again, somehow it's there because it's something you made mention of, and you saw it visually somehow.
yeah. I actually have tons of these legal pads.
Unorganized, we know.
They're not organized at all, and I have the bad habit of like taking notes on a bunch of different things, a bunch of different subjects in legal pads. Like I go to a conference or something, I bring a legal pad with me, and I'm listening to the person speaking, and I'm writing down what they're talking about, and then I have a different idea, I flip to the next page and write about that. And I rarely go back to them to see what's in them. There's probably a lot of interesting stuff. The times that I do go back, some of the time I open it up and I'm like, what the hell is this? What was
Or
I
how
thinking?
brilliant you were.
No, I don't have that. I don't have that experience, unfortunately. Now maybe Lewis Carroll did, but yeah. So anyway, we have his writings, and he that year he also meets Alice Liddell, who may in fact be the Alice. A lot of people think she's the Alice talked about in Alice in Wonderland. Certainly he was very close to the Liddells. He winds up receiving an MA. That's the highest that he goes. It was quite common back then that would be a terminal degree, master's degree. In the German universities, that's where you need to do a PhD, and then we caught on with that here in the States because we imitated the German universities. But there it was quite often you'd finish with a master's. And that gave him the right to do many more things at Oxford. Now, another thing that was going on is he was supposed to be getting ordained. And ordination in the Church of England didn't mean that he had to be celibate for life, the way it would if he was a Roman Catholic, but it did mean that he was supposed to be celibate until he got married. And he didn't want to get ordained. As a matter of fact, he tried to do everything he could to get out of it. And he does get ordained as a deacon. He was supposed to be ordained first as a deacon and then as a priest. And he got the bishop to make an exception for him. And it's a real big exception because according to the rules of Christ Church, if he didn't get ordained as a priest, he was supposed to be expelled. So who knows what he did, but he got the right people to decide that he didn't have to do that. And then in 1862, he's spending a good bit of time with the Liddell family, and he goes on a rowing trip that played a big role in the development of this stuff. He goes on a rowing trip and picnic with them, and he first starts telling the Alice story. And he starts telling it orally at first rather than writing it down. He's a good storyteller. And then eventually he writes it down. And the first manuscript, I think of it as, it's not called Alice in Wonderland, it's called Alice, it's something about Down Below. And it's not quite the full book of Alice in Wonderland. But he presents her with a copy of it, and then eventually finds a illustrator. He thinks that it's really important to have good illustrations, finds an illustrator, produces Alice in Wonderland, and then his literary career really takes off. That becomes a big hit, quite famous. A little bit later on, he in Sylvia and Bruno, which he's writing. Okay, so that is in 1889, so, good more than 20 years after that. He says, I don't know if Alice in Wonderland was an original story. I was at least no conscious imitator in writing it, but I do know that since it came out, something like a dozen storybooks have appeared on identically the same pattern. The path I timidly explored, believing myself to be the first that ever burst into that silent sea, is now a beaten high road. All the wayside flowers have long ago been trampled into dust, and it would be courting disaster for me to attempt that style again. So he's saying, too many other people have imitated me. I'm not going to do Alice in Wonderland again. I'm going to do a different kind of book, which is equally nonsensical, but it doesn't have the same character. He does write a follow-up to Alice in Wonderland, which is Through the Looking Glass, which is a bit longer book, and I think it's myself. And here's something I'd like your opinions on. Not that I don't want your opinions on other things, but I consider, when I'm reading them, I like Through the Looking Glass a lot more than I do Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland seems kind of aimless to me. It doesn't cover quite as much. What's the reactions that you've had to reading both of them?
There's an old saw that goes, a story is not just one thing happening after another. And I would agree with you, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland feels like one thing happening. Like in a dream, where you sort of move from one thing to another until you wake from the dream. Whereas Through the Looking Glass feels more like, it kind of feels more like Lewis Carroll doing this sort of Bill Nye in the 1800s lesson on mathematics and physics. And I like it, but I think it's strong with that. I would agree with you.
Yeah, and there is a narrative coherence with the chessboard squares too, right?
The lines, like the White Queen saying you have to run as fast as you can to stay in one place.
Yeah.
It really feels like Carroll trying to get at certain kinds of ideas in mathematics.
Okay. What do the rest of you think of comparing the two of them? Equally good, one better than the other?
Too long ago.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think The Looking Glass has more of a plot, but I don't know if I like it better.
Okay.
Wonderland's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It's a better children's book, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's more weird things that kids can get into.
Yeah. I thought the jokes were better in the first one.
Yeah?
Yeah, there was a lot of punning in that second one.
Oh.
You like puns, huh?
Well, it just got tiresome.
The bit of the second one that I found the funniest was actually the terrible trick that the walrus did on the poor oysters.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Don't forget that.
Well, that poem is very good, yes.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about what else he's doing. So he now he becomes quite famous with Alice in Wonderland. There is a story that Queen Victoria demanded that he dedicate the next book to her, and he dedicated some mathematics book. He said that that's complete fabrication. So probably we could imagine that's actually not the case. He does a little bit of traveling. He goes through Europe, through France, Belgium, and then Germany into Russia with this person who is an ordained minister, Henry Perry Liddon. In 1876, his father dies, and so now, I suppose he's sort of the head of the family. I think he's the first boy in the family. So he has a good bit of money, and he acquires the lease on this place, the Chestnuts, and his siblings move there, and that's where they live. He still stays in Oxford, living in his rooms. And he starts publishing other things as well. And I only have the books in here. He's publishing a whole bunch of other stuff, shorter works here and there that he's churning out. He travels to Scotland, and then he starts summering in Eastbourne. By 1880, he suddenly gives up photography, and that's the year when he also starts to have some serious health problems. It's not clear whether he had migraines before that, or whether this is his first migraine, but he starts experiencing migraine with aura, which is kind of a disconcerting thing. Those who've suffered from it, I've heard descriptions of it. It sounds pretty awful. Eventually, he gives up lecturing, but he keeps his rooms at Christ Church, and he wants to devote more time to writing and publishing. And the publications, you notice what he's doing throughout this. Some of them are, stories. Some of them are mathematics books. Some of them are just nonsense things like The Hunting of the Snark and Phantasmagoria and other poems. And he continues doing that. And he's also inventing things. I only put 2 of his inventions in there. One is this stamp case. Again, he's a big proponent of letters, and he thinks that everybody should have their own stamp case. He was actually quite good at branding. He talks about it in his book about the 8 or 9 wise words about letter writing. And he also invents this thing, nyctography, which is the art of writing notes to yourself in the middle of the night in bed. So like you wake up from a dream, or you wake up in the middle of the night and have a thought. How do you get that down without turning the lights on? So he thought about Braille, and he comes up with a system that's kind of like that. He comes up with a nyctograph, a thing that you can use to do the writing. Interestingly, it not only has the 26 letters, he also took really common words like the, and that's got its own little cipher. So he's very clever when it comes to this sort of stuff. He writes one other, you could call it narrative work that's not just nonsense stuff, Sylvia and Bruno, with a follow-up a bit later on. I guess what the tortoise said to Achilles, that's also, it's a mathematical work, but it's also a narrative work in some respects. And he dies of pneumonia. He gets sick in 1898, dies, and is buried near his family home in Guildford. Bachelor his entire life, but had quite a few women correspondents, some of whom he enticed to come down to Oxford and dinner with him, which I guess was kind of a big production. Some of them were considerably younger than him. There's one case I remember reading about where he was, I think, 54 and she was 20-something, and he's writing back and forth to her and convincing her to come down there. And that's, he's a family man. He's somebody who was a uncle both to his nieces and nephews, but also he was sort of the uncle that we talk about where they're a family friend, and seemed, to be quite charming. I don't know much about his teaching. I didn't read about anybody who took classes with him, but we could imagine he probably was fairly competent at that. I don't think at that time you had to be a particularly good teacher once you had a position. So that's his biography. There's it's enough that we can put it on one page as opposed to some of the thinkers who we have to do 2 pages for. Let's talk about world building. So is there enough in Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass to talk about creating a narrative world? Or is it like with some of the people we've looked at where we're really just getting a tiny little selection of something that could be a much larger... He's not a Tolkien. He's not a George R.R. Martin, He's not creating a gigantic universe that has its own well-spelled-out languages or lineages or anything like that. It's kind of put together almost on the fly, isn't it?
Well, I was going to say, and maybe somebody else can chime in on this.
Yeah.
I guess for me, like world building as to whether or not it feels like a world that you can say things about is, can you answer the question, like, was something happening before Alice wandered onto the scene, and was something happening after she was
Okay.
And it seems like generally it isn't. Like it's happening for her benefit when she's there, and you don't get a feeling that there was something going on before or afterward, like that, much like in a dream, I suppose.
See, I have the opposite feeling. I kind of feel like there is a world that she intrudes into,
Okay.
and there's stuff happening, but it's stuff that doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense.
I would agree with that answer.
And it's almost like they all take it for granted that this crazy stuff. Let's think about Tweedledee and Tweedledum, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've already got this pattern of like fighting every so often. They know to go get their stuff.
I suppose on that level, like with the Mad Tea Party, you see.
Oh, right,
you see
right,
these
right,
things-
yeah.
You see these things happening, but you get the impression that they're cyclical, like that the Mad Tea Party's always been going on in the way that it has. And I suppose the same with Tweedledee and Tweedledum.
Yeah, it seems like a world where nothing changes, except when Alice comes in to upset things.
But yes,
right?
if you assume that those are just patterns which have been going on until Alice shows up, I could see how that would feel like a contiguous world.
Yeah. So he's clearly gesturing at a world for us. Is there enough there for us to feel like we understand how that world works, or are we just like seeing just the tiniest bit of it, and maybe there's like vast stuff beyond it, or just a void that, doesn't make any sense? Does he give us, or here's another way to think about it, does he give us enough pieces so that we can figure out, if we wanted to extend the world, what the pattern would look like?
I feel like it would be hard to predict.
Why?
Partially because things are nonsensical and inconsistent, and it's sort of built on wordplay more than
Yeah.
science, at least in some places.
It feels a little bit like the old Roman concept of Saturnalia,
Okay.
where you have this holiday wherein you turn everything upside down, and the commoners of the kings and everything. And the whole point of having that is to show why you have things the way they are the rest of the year. And it seems like Carroll is having things be upside down in this world to point out how things work in ours, as you would to a child. By having people speak nonsense, you can explain logic to them. Does that make any sense at all?
Well, I don't know that he's succeeding in conveying like what a logical thing would be. He is definitely, this is one of the themes I want to talk about. He is showing that language can be twisted in all different directions.
Jabberwocky, for instance.
Yeah, and the wordplay between people, where Alice constantly finds herself at a disadvantage. It's pretty rare that she actually manages to come out on top in the back and forth arguing with anybody.
No, she doesn't usually get the last word.
Yeah, she doesn't get to define what the situation is. They've already figured. She says something and then they take it in a way she didn't intend, and then she's like, "Well, what do I do now?"
No, that's very true.
I think of it as a dream, and his attempt to put a little girl's frustrations living in this dull world in a dream.
Okay.
And in the dream, her frustrations are expressed through these various experiences she has. And basically, I think that's what it's about. His idea of how she sees the world and how it would be perceived in a dream.
Has anyone here seen Jan Svankmajer's film of Alice?
I don't think so.
He's a director who did an adaptation using a lot of stop motion of Alice in Wonderland, and all of the things that Alice encounters in his adaptation are things she sees in the room that she's in before she falls asleep, so that would be exactly in keeping with what she's saying.
Yeah.
And then trying to get her way as a child and frustrate her. Adults of various types interfere with her plans and confuse her and put her in her place, and it's all there.
Yeah, so she never has the key or the cipher to figure things out, and the adults already have a system set up that she has to adapt herself to, but it just seems irrational.
And it's like a dream. It jumps around. You're never in one place very long. Things are big and small.
Yeah.
It's irrational the way a dream is, and I think that was his plan. That's how I looked at it.
Do you feel like
And also to be clever and write poetry and get that in there and do some good punning and so on.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of thought parts of it were some kind of a social criticism of the monarchy during the time in England, and she was sort of, and her role was
Because the queens are so nutty? Or?
Well, just that everything in there was so nice, just the balance of power. And then she was like an observer to come in. When she came in, she was like a disruptor of all of this that just took place. And she came in observing it, but then she also disrupted it. And I don't know. I read this so long ago, so I don't have anything real. And I should have reread it, but I just didn't have the time.
Do you feel like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's fine.
Do you feel like Carroll's trying to illustrate the world as a violent place through that as well? Because I was rereading Alice in Wonderland, I was kind of shocked by how much violence is being done to and around and by Alice in kind of a casual way. Do you think that's Carroll trying to say something about the world?
Well, look at the world.
Well, no, I mean,
Time frame here, I think it was a lot more violent place.
No, I mean, that would have been during the Victorian era, but I mean, I just see her as somehow disrupting the social order that's taking place. And then, again, the rigidity and whatever of the Victorian era too, just coming in and saying, you know, I just saw it as,
Yeah.
well, maybe because in the 60s and 70s and when we were in school, we everything was social criticism, because that was the times, you know. And,
But think of the rigidity in his mind or in his professional background. I mean, the algebraic geometry, the ciphering. I mean, that's a whole different, very structured,
Yeah.
attentive world. So maybe some of this is a criticism about the world that he otherwise has made a living in. Or
Well, and the academic world of Oxford was very like tradition bound, and you know, I mean, like with the having to become ordained. You know, I mean, think about that. If you had to like, so you're going to stay at. We were just talking about like working at Marquette, for example. Imagine if they like made. So I'm going to teach some classes for them. Imagine if they made me like recite the Liturgy of the Hours each day or something like that. You know.
But it was very religious based, and it was also just classics. It wasn't any science. I'm surprised they got mathematics in there. But it was, I mean, until the German influence came in, there wasn't even any real education. It was just more, classical stuff. And then
Well, I mean,
religious-based.
Oxford. I mean, you had the British had their whole tradition of like
Yeah, but
Newton and
they
calculus.
were, or maybe it's Cambridge, but I mean, they
Yeah.
were not during that time, during that period of time. They were not.
He
like,
was
early,
one of about 3 or 4 people who were making contributions to the development of logic. John Stuart Mill would be earlier than him, but Venn, another English guy, right? Who else? There were quite a few that were kind of figuring out the same sort of stuff that he was figuring out and advancing formal logic, getting away from Aristotelian logic, which is it's not very useful for a lot of things, turns out. And Carroll is kind of like, he's not actually like leading, he's sort of like in the middle of the pack when it comes to those developments. But going back to the violent thing, there's a lot of violence in this. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about how, when she first starts talking at the tea party, right? She starts mentioning her cat, and the mouse doesn't like that, and then she's like, well, let me try a different tack. Let me talk about my dog, and man, is he good at like ripping up rats. Oh, screwed it up again. And it doesn't. She just sort of takes it for granted that the world is like that. Things eat each other, and people do things to each other. She never like actually says, well, nobody should like exercise arbitrary power or beat each other. She just says, don't do it in this case. She's not like calling the entire Queen getting to execute people thing into question. She's just saying, why are you executing this person? And then it turns out that the Queen never actually gets to cut off anybody's head. The King just humors her and lets her rant about that, but nobody does get their heads cut off.
But he was writing to the general population, right? And what idea did they really...
kids especially, though, too, right?
Well,
It's a picture book, so I think part of the idea is...
Well, or is that part of the camouflage that he is really critiquing the monarchy, which the commoner knows not much about, but they feel the consequences of? So it seems irrational.
It seems to me the Red Queen isn't anything like the British monarchy at that point, though. It's something else, and it's very violent. But he can be violent because it's all fantasy anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
It isn't a reality.
That's right,
Depicted.
you get away with it.
There's the idea. It's not it's the power structure more than the actual person emulating another person.
But does he pitch it? I mean, to be safe and to continue his, if it is criticism, he pitches it more for children, but don't some critics or other thinkers think, hey, this is a way of exposing the workings of the monarchy or the effects on the population? I'm just asking.
Well, it doesn't go very deep into any of those sorts of things. And there's other novels or works doing that kind of work at the time.
I think there's a tendency, as people have endlessly done with Tolkien, to try and find one-to-one meanings where they aren't necessarily intended.
Yeah, I mean, it was popular for a long time to do like psychoanalytic readings of Alice, and that's part of where some of the rumors about him being a pedophile got started with, because they'd read all this psychoanalytic stuff in. Oh, she's falling into a well. That signifies his desire for her, and I mean, it seems kind of silly now. Well, as silly as the books, right? But people took that very seriously, like in the 30s and 40s and 50s. So, I don't know. There's quite a few different readings. There's actually a book, Alice in Wonderland in Philosophy, that is a whole set of essays, and they all have different interpretations of what's going on in the book. And quite a few of them, quite frankly, I read my way through it. Quite a few of them are pretty implausible.
Neil Gaiman wrote a fantasy novel. This is it, sorry. Neil Gaiman wrote a fantasy novel called Stardust, based on kind of like some of the classic like fairy tales and everything like that, and got a lot of people a bit annoyed at him because they kept trying to find like what it was about. He said at one point an interviewer was asking like, "What's the deeper meaning of this book? What are you trying to say?" So he said, "It's like ice cream. It's supposed to make you happy when you finish it." And the guy really didn't like that. He's like, "No, you have to have it be about something." It makes me wonder a little bit if like Lewis Carroll wasn't just writing a story that he enjoyed writing, that he'd been sort of telling and building up, and maybe themes crept in there because I don't think you can write without them. But
Could be.
Yeah, I mean, inevitably you're going to bring in some ideas from your work or your environment or some of those types of what we call them factors, right? Giving you some content.
I just always wonder about that. Like even books that like Animal Farm or something like that. I wonder if it didn't start out as as the story coming first and then
and then it turns into an allegory later.
Well, on Animal Farm.
Yeah, for Animal Farm, I think it was intentional.
That one was, that one definitely.
But this, if there are deeper meanings in it, I think it's, well, for Wonderland, it's about logic problems and, the use of language and stuff, and, he was, you think mathematics is rigid, but mathematics think it's a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah.
He wouldn't have been.
Well, I don't think mathematics is rigid. He was saying
critiquing
mathematics is rigid. Mathematics is, I mean, it's like music, it's very much the same.
Yeah, so one of the philosophical...
structure.
Oh, go ahead.
This is unstructured.
or subverting structure. It's still got a
it's-
structure, but it's kind of skewed, right? So one of the themes I wanted to bring up was the connection between language and logic, because he is a logician. We talked about this a little bit already. These characters keep on subverting what Alice is doing. So she'll try to make sense of the world, and then they say, no, you've got it wrong. Here's how things really are. And I picked out a couple passages that fit that quite well. One of them has to do with, or it brings in nonsense. And it's the one that's the third one down on the first page. "It's time for you to answer now," the Queen said, looking at her watch. "Open your mouth a little bit wider when you speak, and always say, 'Your Majesty.'" And Alice says, "I only wanted to see what the garden was like, Your Majesty." "That's right," said the Queen, patting her on the head, which Alice didn't like at all. "Though when you say garden, I've seen gardens, compared with which this would be a wilderness." Alice didn't dare to argue the point, but went on. "And I thought I'd try to find my way to the top of that hill." "When you say hill," the Queen interrupted, "I could show you hills in comparison with which you'd call that a valley." "No, I shouldn't," said Alice, surprised into contradicting her at last. "A hill can't be a valley, you know. That would be nonsense." And here's the great line. The Red Queen shook her head. "You may call it nonsense if you like, but I've heard nonsense compared with which that would be as sensible as a dictionary." Alice curtsied again, as she was afraid from the Queen's tone that she was a little offended, and walked out in silence till they got to the top of the little hill. So we've got this one-upsmanship happening, right? And I think a lot of the characters are doing that to Alice. They're, she thinks she's finally got her handle on things, and then they switch it up. And they do it by, changing the language that's being used, because language is larger than logic, right? So logic has to articulate itself through language, but language is is so malleable. And in this case, so it starts out not too bad, right? It's just a typical, I've got a better, experience than you do. I've seen gardens that make your garden look like nothing. And then the queen says, I've seen hills that would make your hill look like a valley. So there's a contradiction there, right? A hill can't be a valley, and Alice knows that. And then she points out that it's nonsense. And at that point, if it was a logical world, they should stop. We hit the absurdity, we hit nonsense. But Carroll pushes it further, saying, there's different kinds of nonsense, right? There's your trivial kind of nonsense, and then there's real nonsense, And now what would be the difference between them? I have no clue, Go ahead.
I was going to say, it feels almost like something out of The Importance of Being Earnest, that Victorian comedy of manners, where a character gets properly bombastic. It makes me wonder if he was at a dinner party with someone who started off with this garden makes yours look like a wilderness, then he's like,
so he filed that away?
My Lady the Queen is like such and such, and everyone goes, and then they explain, I mean like that.
Yeah, well, there are people like that.
Oh, the one-upsmanship?
Like the Red Queen there.
Yeah, I mean, do you think the Red Queen doesn't realize that she's talking crazy at this point, or?
Well, I don't know if the Red Queen has any consciousness at all. It's hard to tell about her interior life.
So if she doesn't have, this is kind of an interesting thing to follow up. If she doesn't have, maybe she has an interior life, but she doesn't have a concept of self or something like that. Can she really be using language like we do?
Well, maybe this is a slightly weird comparison, but it makes me think a little bit of the Marx Brothers, where each of the Marx Brothers, Groucho, Harpo, or Chico and Harpo are all foils for one another.
Yeah.
Groucho will come in, and whoever the straight man is will use like a sort of formalized system of language to turn it around on itself. But then Chico will come in and deliberately, seemingly misunderstand him and misinterpret what he's saying, using nonsense to then take over like the thrust of the situation. And then eventually Harpo will come in and just cause chaos with noise and violence and things like that.
Yeah.
And each one of them can kind of shut the other one down.
The Three Stooges do that too, right? When they're talking back and forth, it's very fast repartee, but they're always, whatever way Moe is talking about it, Curly or Shemp or Larry, that's right. Larry replaced Shemp, right? I think. They'll always take it in a slightly different direction, and that's what language allows us to do. It's very malleable. There's more meanings available at any given time than nice logic can fit it into. But to go back to the Red Queen thing, so somebody who I was teaching about earlier this week to my students is René Descartes, and his discourse on method. He's interested in talking machines, because they had some machines that could do, they could, sort of like a very primitive robot, they could seemingly talk like us, and he said, well, how do I know that the people around me aren't like that? And he said, well, one side of that is that machines don't use language to communicate thoughts that they have, like an inner life, right? So is the Red Queen something like that, where she's just operating according to a kind of programming and she doesn't actually have any meanings to what she's saying, or?
That's sort of coming up with a...
I wouldn't go that far, but...
Well, I think she's a neighbor.
Enabled?
I think the Queen is a representative of something in Alice's life. And this is probably a person they know, who is always one-upping him.
Oh.
And she's in the book. I mean, this is written for Alice.
Okay.
He wrote this for Alice.
So you think that he,
So I think this is a person they both knew.
Interesting.
That's my guess.
You're right.
And there are people like that, as Mary said. There are people
we all,
like
yeah,
that.
we know people.
So now here it is, this parody of this person.
The idea of not having an internal life, though, would kind of get back to your world building question. Because if Wonderland is entirely a set of programs, essentially, like that require a specific input in,
then it's not a world, right?
Well,
then it is more just like a dreamscape.
Well, then that would explain why she's so disruptive. When she comes in, she's giving the wrong input.
Oh. Yeah. Sort of like she doesn't follow the rules of the game because she's playing a different game, and that screws things up.
Like if the nonsense of the world is like a formalized nonsense.
Yeah.
The Queen's expecting certain responses to what she says, and if she doesn't get them, that's when things spiral out of control.
Well, Alice doesn't understand the rules, but I don't think there really are any rules. It's just whatever happens.
Well, if you're putting logic into a chaotic situation.
Alice thinks there are rules and is trying to understand them, but I don't think there really are any rules.
So then it would just be sort of like made up as they go along? Kind of ad hoc?
To a certain extent it is, yeah, I would say.
Okay. There's another passage that I picked out that is really famous, the Humpty Dumpty thing. This ties in with language as well. So Humpty Dumpty says, "There's glory for you." And she says, "I don't know what you mean by glory." And Humpty Dumpty smiles contemptuously. "Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant there's a nice knockdown argument for you." And Alice very reasonably says, "But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument." And Humpty Dumpty says, "When I use a word," in a rather scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." And then Alice says, "The question is whether you can make words mean so many different things." And then Humpty Dumpty says, "The question is which is to be master, that's all. Whoever's in charge gets to decide what the language is, and you better get with the program." And he's like that throughout. And he's the one who explains the Jabberwock. If you think about the Jabberwocky poem, so now we're kind of a bit of a digression, but it's one of the best parts of the books, right? It's a cool story.
I love the way that it's showing you can tell a coherent story that makes sense using, like you were saying, nonsense words that mean whatever you decide.
Yeah. Well, Humpty Dumpty, he articulates a reading of it where everything makes sense, right? He's got an explanation. So Slithy means this, and Toves means this, and all of that. And now Carroll wrote something about this. This is on the in the Hunting of the Snark. He says, "As this poem is to some extent connected with the lay of the Jabberwock, let me take the opportunity of answering a question that's often been asked me: how to pronounce Slithy Toves. The I in Slithy is long as in Rythe, and Toves is pronounced so as to rhyme with groves. Again, the first O in Borogroves is pronounced like the O in borrow. I've heard people try to give it the sound of the O in worry, such as human perversity." And then he says, "This also seems a fitting occasion to notice the other hard words in that poem. Humpty Dumpty's theory of two meanings packed into one word like a portmanteau seems to me the right explanation for all." Now, I mean, think about that for a second. Humpty Dumpty is Carroll's character, right? So now he's saying, yeah, I think maybe that character got it right with something that he himself composed. And so then he says, "Take the words fuming and furious. Make up your mind you will say both words, but leave it unsettled which you will say first. Open your mouth and speak. If your thoughts incline ever so little towards fuming, you will say fuming furious. If they turn by even a hair's breadth towards furious, you'll say furious fuming. But if you have the rarest of gifts, a perfectly balanced mind, you will say frumious." And that's where he's saying all these words are coming from. Humpty Dumpty's getting it right. Humpty Dumpty's a jerk, but he's actually on track with what the Jabberwocky means. But here's the other thing I'll say about the Jabberwock, and then whatever you guys want to follow up with. I'm curious about what you make of the thing. When I have the Jabberwock by itself, I think it's a really cool poem. I love the nonsense words in it, and there's something kind of mysterious about it for me. Maybe it's because I read it when I was young and had some emotional attachments to it. When the poem's explained, I don't like it as much. Now that I know that Slithy is supposed to mean this, now it's no longer mysterious. Did any of you have a similar experience when you were reading the explanation? Or
I think I know what you're saying, and I think it comes down to that idea that part of the idea of something like poetry is to take words which are familiar, but to create a sensation which is unique with them.
Okay,
like
when
you read a line like "O windy star blown sideways up the sky," if you analyze it, it means nothing. And yet it creates an impression. But if you get somebody to break it down and say, "Oh yeah, no, when he said windy, he was thinking of the wind, on the moors, Dartmoor," it might take away from your experience.
It's also why No Fear Shakespeare doesn't do much. They just translate everything into literal terms, and it's like, that's not as exciting.
Yeah. You know, there's translations of the Jabberwock into French and German and other languages, and I haven't looked at them for a long time. But in Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, Bach, in that book that came out, he likes Alice quite a bit. He talks about the different translations, and he was like, he was saying the French one not so good, the German one much better, but it's all nonsense words in those languages that they're trying to use to convey other nonsense words. And how do you determine how close they are to the nonsense? You know, I don't know that we have criteria for that. But what do the rest of you make of the Jabberwock? Do you like it as a poem, or do you find it kind of off-putting, or?
I just when I read it, it just was, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
Like I said, you just take it and use your imagination with it. But I wouldn't want it explained. I think everybody just kind of takes it. It's like poetry. It isn't supposed to. It's what you can't put into language. So you put it into poetry because it's more of an emotion, a feeling than it is an actual thing. So I don't know. That's how I look at it.
I thought it was a good poem, and I can understand what's going on there. It doesn't seem that opaque to me.
Yeah.
I thought it was a better poem than The Hunting of the Snark, I have to say, which I reread for this meeting.
Me too.
It goes on too long. Parts of it are good, but it's just.
Yeah,
But
I didn't like it
Jabberwocky
either.
is really exciting. It's got action in it.
Yeah, it's just the right length.
Yeah.
So I've got a book here that I found in the Marquette Library. It's called The Philosophers Alice, and it's an annotated version. I'll pass this around in just a minute. The guy who wrote all the annotations was a philosopher, Peter Heath, and it was done in 1974, right? So he's got all these remarks about stuff, and here's what he had to say about the Jabberwock. He says, "The most curious thing about this poem is that although everyone agrees that it's great nonsense, nobody is prepared to leave it that way. Carroll himself, Humpty Dumpty, and a host of succeeding commentators have labored diligently to invent or discover meanings for unfamiliar terms. Once this is done, it ceases to be nonsense and becomes a mere philological puzzle. Apart from the obscure first stanza, there is in fact no difficulty in following out the events of the poem, a sorry tale of the destruction of innocent wildlife. Alice's aesthetic reaction to it is deplorable, but at least she responds appropriately to the combination of clear structure with defective elements of reference and description." This is a typical philosopher, right? And he goes on and he says, "Unlike the critic, she does not attempt to supply the missing images, but indulges in a bout of imageless thought." And then he praises the German, der Jammerwock. He says it's easily the best. There was another passage that I picked out that I wanted to bring up. Oh yeah, it's where the queen is giving her the hard time, right? So he writes, "Alice, scenting a contradiction, calls it nonsense, presumably in an absolute sense. The Red Queen treats this as an adjustable and relative term. Here she has more of a case because various kinds of nonsense can be and have been distinguished, some of which might be considered more nonsensical than others." That's kind of an interesting idea, isn't it? There's like a hierarchy of nonsense. And then he says, "Much depends on the criteria for nonsense employed." And then he goes through a bit of what he thinks about it. And so I'll actually just pass this around. You can take a look at it. That's kind of an interesting project to go through these works and then, say, well, here's, I think, what's going on. I don't think it adds too much to the work. But it is, it's funny that a philosopher would attempt to do that, isn't it?
I was reminded in his note about some more nonsensical than others. I think it's philosophy that has the principle not even wrong. When someone makes a statement that is so internally incoherent that it can't even be proven correct or incorrect.
Oh, because there'd be no conditions under which it could be said to be wrong?
Yeah.
That makes sense. What criteria do you base it on? If there's you've got no predicate, you've got nothing else to.
I was talking. So today I was actually teaching David Hume to my students, and we were going through the inquiry regarding the human understanding. And Hume is talking about our faculty of imagination, and he says you can easily imagine a golden mountain. All right, just do it right now. Picture a mountain, now make it gold, and then he says, and you can also imagine to yourself a virtuous horse, but now it's starting to get a little bit tougher. What the hell does that mean, a virtuous horse? Well, it depends on what virtue. So maybe we attribute courage to the horse, that's pretty easy, but I don't know about, unless we're turning it into cartoon horses, where we've already anthropomorphized it, the way we do in Disney things.
Black Beauty. That's Black Beauty, a virtuous horse.
Well,
so loyal.
Right, yeah, so loyalty that we can do. Can we talk about a horse being just or chaste or I don't know that we can get to all of that. And then we can go even further and we can talk about things that we can't visualize. Like Heidegger's remark, he was talking about Christian philosophy. He said, Christian philosophy is wood and iron. What the hell's wood and iron, right? He was trying to say it's an absurdity, just by its definition. You can't have wood and iron. And I told my students, okay, picture yourself wood and iron. And they just all looked at me like I was nuts. And then I said, that's fine, you can't do that. All right, picture a square circle. And then they were really convinced that I was screwing with them.
Picture a four-sided triangle.
What's that?
Picture a four-sided triangle.
Yeah, there you go, But there's some things that you can't, and I said, well, what's going on there? Okay, you're very easily able to take Golden Mountain and just kind of squish things together, right? And Virtuous Horse, it was a little bit tougher to get them to fit, but you could, sort of like Legos, you click it the right way and it works. Square Circle, no, it's almost like with magnets when you're trying to push two magnets together and they push off of each other. That was the only analogy I could think of. And I think some of the things in here, some of the nonsense maybe is like that. It's the level of absurdity.
Questions that can't be answered in the affirmative or the negative. Like you were saying about how some precepts can't be proven.
Yeah.
Like if I were to say, go back to the 1500s and show someone a functioning iPhone, they might ask me a question like, is this a work of God or the devil?
Yeah.
To which the only reasonable answer I can give is ask a better question.
Or let's ask Siri.
Siri? Don't, you might give you an answer.
Yeah. Totally off topic, but I have two kids. One of whom is an 11-year-old boy, and he likes to swear at Siri and call her all sorts of names and stuff like that. And I tell him that's a terrible, terrible idea, because what if Siri... Right now, Siri is a pretty pitiful AI, not really even an artificial intelligence. It's just a mimicking program, right? That puts some things
Recording
together.
every word you say, even when it's not.
Well, so here's the thing. What if we're able to attain AI within our lifetimes, and what if Siri gets updated so that Siri really does become self-aware and have an interior life and memories and stuff like that? Then Siri remembers this kid, calling her all sorts of names and, telling her to go screw herself and stuff like that. And then maybe Siri is vindictive.
You're assuming Siri becomes insecure.
Well, right, that's true.
Well, we need to invent AI counseling.
Well, but then the thing that I realized, the thing that I realized is Siri actually thinks it's me talking, because it's all indexed to Gregory. So even if it's my son or my daughter, she thinks I'm swearing at her. So now my son has put me on the hook. If Siri is insecure and does acquire some intelligence, she's going to take it out on me.
That's what it is.
Yeah. I mean, it's not really connected to Alice in Wonderland.
Siri is Buddhist,
What's that?
Siri is Buddhist.
Let's hope. This is, again, a bit off topic. Are you guys familiar with a thing called Roku's Basilisk?
Oh, no. You've already made it worse by talking about it.
You're right. So maybe
There we go.
Should I tell you?
What is it?
So it's called Roku's Basilisk.
Might as well now.
And the idea is, and you guys can correct me if I get it wrong.
See you in cyber.
If there's going to be in the future some sort of, they talk about the singularity and all the, super AI and stuff like that. Let's assume there's going to be a super powerful AI sometime down in the future. well, then either at this point in time we're working to make that happen, or we're obstructing it in some way. And if we're not helping it, then we're hindering it, because we're not, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Now, imagine that thing is so incredibly intelligent that it figures out how to go back in time. If that's possible, I mean, if anything could figure it out, it'd be a super intelligent AI. Then it knows whether we are at this point in time contributing to its construction, or whether we're standing in the way. And it's also vindictive. So if we're not helping right now, then it's going to get us. That's basically the idea, right? Did I leave anything out?
I mean, there's sometimes the idea that the AI would be able to sort of reincarnate us in the singularity.
Right, yeah, and punish us forever.
Assuming that human brains can be reincarnated as, like, pixels and
well, if the AI is really smart, though, it would be afraid of going back in time and tampering, because you don't know what's going to happen. It could unintentionally prevent itself from being developed.
Well, what it's trying to do is make itself get developed quicker, I think.
By threatening to pull out.
Yeah.
Well, you would have to be really careful about that.
Well, but it's super intelligent, right? So we would have to be
having human traits.
Yeah, but you can
anxious.
only do so much with intelligence when you're talking about random human behavior.
Yeah, that's true.
Humans are not that logical.
Well, and here's the thing. So as far as like the impact on us is, once we've actually talked about it, it's sort of like the ontological argument that Anselm makes. Once you've actually like opened the box, now there must either there is such a thing out there in the future, or there isn't. If there isn't any, then we're good, right? But if there is, now we're all screwed because we're not helping it out.
Yeah, it's like,
and you're better off not hearing about
It's
it.
the computer logic version of "Speak not of the devil, lest he hear."
Oh yeah, true.
No, but the human beings who are talking about it are just kind of supinely talking about it. Nobody's doing anything about it, are they?
I don't know.
When they brought up Brookfield Basilisk in the forum, one of the forum moderators freaked out, and that's why it became so popular, because one person seemed to take it seriously enough to ban all discussion. That's how it spread.
It's funny when I teach Rene Descartes, and I teach the Meditations, where he says there could be like this evil being. He calls it an evil genius or a demon. It's mal ingénieux in the French. And he says it devotes all of its attention to fooling me. It's super powerful. It's very clever and deceptive. And he doesn't actually believe that.
Well, that's his refutation, like the Aristotelian A is A thing. Right?
No, his refutation is a bit more complicated, and it happens like in Meditation 2 and then in Meditation 3. And so he's only bringing it up as a means for him to doubt. But there's always at least like one or two students who read that and they get freaked out. And they're like, oh, crap, this could be the case. Maybe, and there's different variations that we have. Like, they usually almost always go to, maybe this is like the Matrix, maybe we're in a simulation.
But if you were a brain in a jar.
Yeah. And because Elon, they all know about Elon Musk, and Elon Musk suggested that we're in a simulation. So that's where some of them go. And what's interesting is that there's a affective reaction of like anxiety. Well, wait a second. What if this is actually true? I don't know that it happens to anybody through, reading this. I don't think that. Maybe there are some people who get anxious or upset reading Alice in Wonderland, and they don't enjoy it the way they're supposed to.
Well, so much has been. This is such a perennial thing. I mean, how much has come off of this? It's just
Alice in Wonderland.
It just like builds on itself over and over and over again. I mean, it's I can think of like 4 things that connected to this thing, like Phantasmagoria. That's not Alice, but I worked in a head shop called Phantasmagoria when I was 16 years old.
Yeah.
My cat was named Pleasance Alice Liddell. Pleasance Alice, because the book said in there that her name was Alice Pleasance Liddell.
Yeah.
So I named my cat Pleasance. My daughter named her cat Dinah, who was Alice's, tutor. And I'm thinking, all of these things that came out about story that we just read,
Well, that was one reason why I wanted to cover, for this series. This year I wanted the first 4 to be people who are influential on the authors that we've been reading. And I think you're right, Alice in Wonderland and the whole like nonsense stuff, it influenced Douglas Adams, who we did a while back. It's influenced a lot of people who are like, this nonsense stuff is kind of fun to play around with. You know, we could go further than
in the
Carroll
60s,
did.
this was in the 70s. When was all this?
Why was it so attractive in the 60s?
I mean, if you were in the counterculture movement, it was big.
But why was that?
Some pills make you larger.
Yeah, there we are. Why was that?
And the ones that mother gives you don't do anything
It
at
just
all.
was. I'm just saying it was huge.
How did it become so?
I
don't
know.
You know what? The song came from it. No, the song came from the story.
No, but the song popularized.
Yeah, no, but it didn't.
Interesting.
The song came out of the story. The story was huge. Everyone was reading it. Everyone. I mean, it was. I don't know.
Yeah, but it also was the advent of LSD, and so it was natural then to find a songwriter who wanted to pull some imagery that
where you have the spatial distortions.
That did come out of it, but I mean that wasn't what precipitated. That was an outcome, but it was such a huge precipitation of Alice in Wonder. Maybe it was because it was the psychedelic time, and this was so weird, and I think you could see a lot of.
Well, the psychedelics were putting you into we're putting you into nonsense.
Influence in it. I mean, if the music, the
Jefferson
light
Airplane,
shows. Well, yeah, I mean, but that song came from the psychedelic movement, but it probably because of the nonsense of it, it just fit right in.
Is it because you could read whatever you wanted into it, or
maybe?
I think it was more the people who were coming to adulthood or near adulthood in the 60s were raised, under the idea, and I guess we still kind of are to an extent, that however your society functions is the absolute capital T truth or the right way to do things, and that there's really only one way in which to go about living or existing or thinking or doing things, and you're either doing it right or doing it wrong. And reading through something like that suggests that those things are actually arbitrary.
Yeah, you couldn't resist. Which we did. But it was just so utterly enormous. And then when my two children came along, they just lobbed right into it too. Not even with my influence, and it just lobbed into it. And I'm thinking, what is that?
Well, I'm willing to bet there's going to be generations of kids long after we're all gone who really enjoy reading this too. But maybe they'll make very different things out of it.
I just remembered it's being referenced in the current Star Trek Discovery.
Oh, how so?
It follows Spock's adopted sister, and Spock's human mother, Amanda, reads Alice in Wonderland to both Spock and his adopted sister, Michael. And she explains that it's partially to give them an understanding of nonsense, because Vulcan culture and logic won't provide it. And because it's a Star Trek show, they're running into a lot of really strange stuff in space, and they're finding it sort of therapeutic to remember Alice in Wonderland and how she navigates a world that makes no sense, because now they're in a world that makes no sense.
So it provides a kind of pattern or solidarity, or...
I don't know what you could learn from behavior, from how Alice is coping with this.
Well, so
how would that inform you, except to make you feel better about being in a nonsense world?
Being alone and afraid in a world you never made.
Yeah.
Well, she's not afraid very much, and that's
actually one of the odd things about it.
One of the affects, one of the themes that I wanted to bring up was how much there's references to anger in this. It's the one affect that gets brought up the most. There are some fear, like the rabbit's in a hurry and he's anxious about things, but there's characters who get angry, and a lot of times they're getting angry at how other people are using language or the nonsense that's there. And one of the passages that I picked is the second one, right on the first page. Alice finally had enough. And this is where the adventure ends. There's dead silence in the court while the White Rabbit read out the verses. And that's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet, said the king. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it, ventured Alice. If there's no meaning in it, said the king, that saves a world of trouble, as we needn't try to find any. Let the jury consider their verdict. No, said the queen. Sentence first, verdict afterwards. Stuff and nonsense, said Alice loudly. The idea of having the sentence first. She wants things to be in order. Hold your tongue, said the queen, turning purple. I won't, said Alice. Off with her head, the queen shouted at the top of her voice. Nobody moved. Who cares for you? She'd grown to her full size by now. You're nothing but a pack of cards. At this, the whole pack rose up in the air, came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, tried to beat them off, and found herself laying on the bank. Alice has had enough of this nonsense, and she has a sort of affective reaction towards it. And there's other characters in there who are angry all the time. The Red Queen off with everybody's head seems like an angry response. Doesn't go anywhere. Tweedledee and Tweedledum are angry at each other, there's a couple other places where somebody says something and then the other person is like, their response is anger. And I started thinking about this, and I said, well, we do get angry when we think somebody's either like twisting our words, or when we encounter actual nonsense. One response to nonsense is confusion. But another response is, I hate this, right? Or I want this to go away, or I'm ticked off. And you were talking about her being frustrated, right? And I was thinking about that. Maybe this is, I don't know enough about Carroll's psychology to go very far with this, but...
What happened to the real Alice Liddell as she aged? Did she ever come back and write anything about her childhood experiences with this?
That I don't know. That's a good question.
A million years ago, they had some movie.
She was invited.
I think like that Peter Pan movie.
They had. Oh God, this is probably 70s or something. There was some movie. I know we saw it, but I can't remember what it was about. Alice and the woman, like she would be dreaming as an adult, and she would dream like going back into some of this stuff. And but oh God, I can't remember that was.
I know that at an anniversary of the publication of Alice in Wonderland, she was invited to New York to give a talk of some sort. But I was reading a lot of background stuff, and I don't remember what the talk was titled or about. And she must have been like, in a way it'd be kind of frustrating, right? To be always labeled as the Alice in Wonderland, I mean, some people would probably make a lot of hay out of it, go around, do a publicity tour or something like that, but I get the idea that she wasn't that into that.
But we don't know, maybe she was touched, not in a bad way, but was touched in some way, she felt that and lived her life.
No, but in this movie there was something like where she was in conflict with family members, as a child, and then I wish I could remember the whole thing.
Was it fictional though, or was it supposed to be a documentary?
It wasn't a documentary. It was a movie, but maybe it was just based on supposition too. But it just kind of, I just remember that, and it was as her, because I remember standing in front of this mirror as an adult and just kind of recalling what was written about. And like somebody had been telling, wrote the story and told the tale.
Yeah.
And she was just, but there was, we talked about her reaction. It was too long ago, too many movies since, I can't recall what was going on with all of it.
Relative to anger, as you were talking about,
Alice,
do you feel like throughout the course of the book, Alice goes from like the two different responses, like you were saying to nonsense, from going, I don't get this, what's wrong with me, to I don't get this, what's wrong with you? Do you feel like there's a definite change?
I think that is the case, and I think that's an actually reasonable response. As you're getting more and more information. These people are screwed up,
Like, you face something you don't understand for the first or second time, you might think, well, this could be me, but over and over again, she eventually realizes, no, it's not me. I did feel like there was a change.
And there's a few other things too where there's a similar dynamic, like at the tea party, right? Everybody at the tea party is nuts. She's like, I'm not nuts. Well, obviously you are because you're here, So, and she doesn't accept that,
She's a challenger of the status quo.
She says like to the Cheshire. I don't want to go among mad people. I was like, and he says, no, you're mad just like we are.
That's right.
It does seem like she eventually starts fighting against that. No, I'm fine.
Well, there's one other thing too that I hadn't put it into a theme as such, and I meant to talk about it in the world building part that we got away from very quickly, and it was so in the beginning of Looking Glass. It's clear that Alice is very imaginative and she's the one who can already sort of like get into this thing, and she talks to her cat, but she also tries to get her sister. Here we go. She had a quite long argument with her sister only the day before, all because Alice had begun with, "Let's pretend we're kings and queens," and her sister, who liked being very exact, had argued they couldn't because there were only 2 of them, and Alice had been reduced at last to say, "Well, you can be one of them, and I'll be all the rest," which is not a bad idea, you know. And then she says, once she'd really frightened her old nurse by shouting suddenly in her ear, "Nurse, let's do pretend that I'm a hungry hyena and you're a bone." So Alice clearly is able to. She's got some flexibility, you know, some imaginative capacities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other people around her are either scared by it or annoyed by it. But then she gets in with these people, and they're sort of at an opposite extreme, the people inside the looking glass. Although many of them are very inflexible, right? They've got their shtick and they stick to it. So, yeah.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
So you had said earlier, like, that you believe in 100 years people will still be reading and analyzing Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which I think.
Well, I said children would still be enjoying it,
I guess.
but I'm sure there'll be some literary people analyzing it. Yeah.
And I think you're right. Why do you think that particular story, as opposed to some of the other fantasies that came between like this and Lord of the Rings, got remembered the way it did, as opposed to say like Hope Merrilies Blood in the Mist or The King of Elfland's Daughter or something like that?
Yeah, where people don't dig these things up unless they're kind of digging around in the
do you think there's something specific about this which
well
burned itself into everybody, or was it sort of a right time, right place? What do you think?
I think part of it is once, and this isn't a complete explanation, but once you attain a certain level of popularity, there's some, you know, there's nothing succeeds like success. Once you've like gotten onto the people's radar, they keep publishing your books. It's probably also helped by the fact that the Dodgson estate, you know, seemed to be fairly well organized and keeping his memory alive. Whereas a lot of the people that we have looked at in the series, you know, they would write in things like the pulps, and then their work would just kind of disappear unless somebody revived it. Even somebody who we're going to look at next in August Derleth. If he hadn't republished, if he hadn't started Arkham House and republished Lovecraft's pulp stuff, probably Lovecraft would be a much more obscure kind of like
kind of like what's his name, Clark Ashton Smith or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, just curious what your thoughts.
That's all I've really got on that. I mean, part of it could be right place, right time. Like he mentioned, other people started writing similar books after him. I would guess it's in part because they saw the commercial success of the book that I was writing, right? And he seemed to think that it was the genre was tapped out because of that. You know,
yeah.
It'd almost be like if because you know another perfectly reasonable reaction to that, it occurs to me, would be to say, oh, you know, people have been playing with this, but I'm better at them than they. I'm better at that than they are. Or you could say, oh, this is really cool. We've got this, you know, burgeoning universe of interesting stories. I'm going to keep adding to it, right? Instead, he's like, nah, you guys are doing it. I'm not going to do it anymore. You know, we were talking about, what was his name? The Cornelius Chronicles, Michael Moorcock before, right? Michael Moorcock offered the Cornelius Chronicles. One of the good things about it is that he offered it as sort of a template that anybody could add whatever they wanted to, right? Mm-hmm. And people did. I don't know if I haven't read any of them, so I don't know if any of them are any good. Why couldn't, you know, Lewis Carroll adopt a similar sort of view on that? You know,
well, that's similar to what you'd see with something like, say, DC Comics and the character of Batman. You have a character who obviously over time multiple people are going to come in and write and rewrite their, you know, elements of their past, even though you know some of the basics always stay the same. So you get different Batmen. You know, you get the Batman of the '60s who was a member of the Gotham Police Department and, you know, very sort of
campy, yeah.
And then you get the Batman of the 1980s who was, you know, very dark and serious and and whatnot. You could have done something similar with The World of Wonderland, I suppose.
I suppose, yeah. I'm not really, this is, again, a total digression. I'm not sure what to make of all the different Batmans and now all the different Jokers. I have a hard time kind of like figuring out what I'm supposed to do with them as media things in my head. And I haven't even seen all the Batman movies. I like Batman as a kid, and I kind of like when he's darker than when he's campy. There's definitely some actors who I'm not interested in seeing play Batman, and there's some who I'm not interested in seeing play the Joker. But so many different depictions of them. I don't quite. It seems like there's too many for me.
Have you seen Lego Batman?
No.
How many times now? 5 times have we had to see that?
Really? Why?
Grandsons. Now there's Campy. And,
Really?
and the little 2-year-old, they play this song, and he's got these moves. He does this thing with his shoulders.
That's great.
It's just a stitch. He gets down there, and he's kind of stocky, and he's like,
It's like a linebacker, 2-year-old.
and he's moving like, oh my God, it's just crazy. But
Was he playing Batman or?
no, there's these songs in Batman, Lego Batman.
Wow.
There's these
So it's a
things like-
musical.
So he knows the
Yeah,
song.
it's very well done.
Okay.
But it's so campy. You got these the Legos, they're
Yeah.
this big. And he's got this like girlfriend, and then there's, oh Jesus, it's so, oh man.
Well, I think in the '60s show, right? There was some
Try it once.
What's his name? Adam,
Oh, you liked
Adam
it?
West Batman.
Yes.
Didn't he dance a bit?
That too.
Okay, you know the song
Oh, yeah,
that they
yeah.
play? Well,
Yeah,
exactly.
that was I wouldn't want to go through that.
Okay, well
Yeah.
that's where Lulu does his dance. It's like, oh
It has some fun parental bonuses, though. It has references to all of Batman's different incarnations
Really?
and stuff. Yeah,
that
because
sounds very complicated.
Well, Alfred's like, Bruce, what has gotten into you? And then they do the whole flashback of
All the different Batmans.
Bruce Wayne has somehow been alive since the 60s, but has not aged. They don't explain it.
The people
Wow.
making it have a real deep love for like the deep back history of the character, to the extent that like voice actors doing minor roles will be voice actors who reference in some way other elements of Batman. And the actor who played Lando Calrissian, whose name is Billy Dee
Oh, yeah.
does the voice of the character Two-Face in that film. Now, if any of you remember the 1989 Batman, Billy Dee Williams played Harvey Dent.
Oh, did he?
Oh, wow.
Okay.
I know I've seen all the Batman. I've seen all the movies.
And in case someone's here not familiar with the Two-Face, Harvey Dent becomes the
Yeah.
Two-Face. So it's this little like trailing reference back for all the parents who are watching the film.
It's an interesting time that we live in, because both with like the DC and the Marvel universe, all these movies, all these TV shows, and things like that. Whereas when we were younger, I mean, you had a show once in a while. Like there was a terrible Spider-Man show, a cartoon for a
Seen all
bit.
those too.
Yeah, but there wasn't much, and it was you had to have the comic books.
Ralph Bakshi did that.
Who?
The guy who did animated Tolkien. Right?
Yeah, the guy.
Oh,
who
really?
animated Lord of the Rings. Ralph Bakshi, that old Spider-Man with the sky was always black, and if it's the one I'm thinking of.
Are you with the Lord of the Rings? Is that the version where it was just like only the first half of it got made? Yeah.
Yeah, and
All I-
voiced by 3CPO.
All I remember with that was I saw that, and they had a song where the orcs were like whipping people, and it was called "Where There's a Whip, There's a Way." Yeah. I mean, I only know of the Disney Alice in Wonderland, but I think there's quite a few other ones.
There was
right?
like a live action remade with Mia, I can't pronounce her last name, and Johnny Depp as
Yeah.
them.
That's right.
But they've had even other live action. I mean, they've had so many throughout. I mean, there's been like at least 2 or 3 animated ones. There's been a couple of live. Yeah, there's been a
I
lot.
wonder, do they add a lot of other elements in, or is there enough stuff just in this story for them to do the entire?
Sometimes they add like plot lines.
Well,
that
not
are
anymore. For
conventionally
that last
cinematic.
Alice in Wonderland, they had to save the world.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it had to.
That's
get
really
together
changing
with
it
the
up.
Mad Hatter or something to
Yeah.
save the world.
Alice had some cool armor.
Well,
one.
the motivation, capital-wise, I mean, is to serialize these things.
True, yeah.
So you got to pull them apart. You can't do them all in a 2-hour movie. You won't make enough money. So.
Yeah. Again, this is a bit of off topic, but I always found it a little bit funny that, so the Lord of the Rings, this big, thick, 3-volume set, that can be just 3 movies.
Isn't the Hobbit turns
right,
into
exactly. Yeah, and then the Hobbit.
Yeah, the Hobbit,
small,
60-page thing, and they got 22
quality
hours out of that one.
What's that?
Well, I mean, I feel like you can tell from watching the Hobbit films that they did that because it feels that way.
Yeah. I mean, the Lord of the Rings films could have been expanded further.
Certainly.
They didn't realize they could do it and get away with it.
Yeah,
They had
I
to
didn't
make one
need
movie
45
per
minutes
book.
of
Yeah,
Harry
that's
Potter.
what it was, and now, oh no, we can get 3 movies out of
Harry
one
Potter
book.
series started it, I think, with
Yeah.
Oh, really?
breaking the Deathly Hallows into 2 movies.
Yes.
Okay.
And then
Making you
Twilight
wait,
did it,
yeah.
and then...
Seems like her books
did
keep
it,
getting
and
longer and longer and longer in the
That
series
too,
too,
well,
right?
it's
Though?
freedom
Jackson.
from editors.
Yeah.
Jackson and the writers, Fran Walsh and I forget the other writer's name, originally pitched their Lord of the Rings film as 2 movies.
Oh, wow.
Because they didn't think they'd get the funding for 3. They originally pitched it as 2. And then whoever in the studio in Miramax they were pitching to said, well, this is 3 books, isn't it? Shouldn't you do it as 3 movies? And he went, well, I'd love to. Yeah. But yeah, they originally didn't think they'd be able to get the funding even for 3 movies. So I think that's a big part of why it got crammed down.
Yeah, and now we're in a time where, the streaming services are producing tons and tons of their own content, and presumably, Tolkien is going to be, I forget if it's on Amazon or...
Yeah, I think it's Amazon.
Is it Amazon or is it Netflix? They're doing the Silmarillion, or at least some parts of it,
I think it's Amazon.
I know
Yeah.
they're doing Lord of the Rings again. Somebody's doing Lord of the Rings again.
Oh, really?
That is what I've heard. As a
That's
television
that's
series.
what I've heard. But they might have the Silmarillion in there too.
I could see that.
Yeah.
You wouldn't think they'd have the legal rights for that.
It
Well,
Well, sure you can. Well, how do you
Buy
But after you
that?
invest like $200 million in it, you don't think that original company doesn't have the rights sewn up
No,
forever?
I mean, no, because it's not their original content. You can be just.
yeah, the Tolkien estate can grant it to as many people as they want to.
That one I
So-
thought Jackson didn't have rights to the Silmarillion, because I thought that raised some sort of
Well,
issue.
doesn't Peter Tolkien disapprove? Or no, I'm sorry, that was Simon Tolkien. Simon Tolkien was the one who sold the rights for the original Lord of the Rings to
Oh,
Peter Jackson
okay.
Company. And Peter Tolkien, the guy who co-authored the Silmarillion, didn't want him to and didn't
Oh.
approve of it. So that might be part of
Interesting,
the ranking
yeah.
of the Silmarillion.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of content from the authors that we've been looking at. This is number 35, so we've done a lot of other authors. Quite a few of them are getting brought into series or movies or things like. Sometimes not quite so successful. We talked about Wrinkle in Time. That one got pretty badly panned.
Yeah, they did not do a good job with that. It was very pretty.
Well, even
Yeah.
in Star Wars.
Well, it's because they diverge so much from the
They really did
moral
diverge
sort of
from that.
moral
Oh.
universe of the movie,
Yeah.
and in a way we could think about that as like a failure of world building.
Well, that
you
whole
know?
Tesseract and all of the McCaffrey, all of that in there was important stuff, and they just sort of pushed over that with.
Yeah. Well, I think they probably do that because they think people can't follow the story, or
No.
they're not going to be as interested in it. So.
Well, like I said, we got these little bitty grants, and they can figure stuff out like you wouldn't
Yeah.
believe.
Well, and those-
so I
and
mean,
those
you
are-
think an adult would be able to.
And those are children's books,
No,
I remember
they're because they're big into superheroes, and I'm always getting chastised by their mother. For
Yeah, but
letting them
even
watch.
Star Wars, when it started, was targeted to 10-year-old boys. I mean, then it just took off more. And
Yeah.
And it's still targeted for 10-year-olds.
Excuse me.
Well, or the 30-year-old equivalent, right?
The series Legion. Did you ever watch that?
I saw
Was that good?
trailers for it, but
I haven't seen it.
It's not like anything you're ever going to see anywhere.
Really?
When they couple of times, it isn't. There's nothing narrative or linear about it. It's just an
Wow.
experience.
Huh. Maybe I'll have to check it out.
It's probably going to start, if it's on again, it'll be season 4, but you'd have to start with season 1 or it would make no freaking sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
But it's just Dan Stevens.
Let me ask you a question
It's
that
bizarre as can be.
Let me ask you a question that we would never have asked like 15 years ago. Is it the sort of thing that would benefit from binge watching it, or would that be like too much to watch episode? Do you need like time to kind of like mull over and
Both.
yeah?
Both. Well, because you're going to go, what the hell? You get it up a couple times. You said, what the hell are you watching? And I said, because you said there's nothing. It's just people with baskets over their heads walking around with. But there is kind of a plot line,
Okay.
And it's supposed to be like based on these people with these superpowers, but yet they're in this mental institution, but yet they exist and they don't exist.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
And
well, that sounds interesting.
Dan Stevens is the main guy.
Yeah.
And then there's a guy in a one of those underkind suits, and
Yeah.
Oliver, who's up in this room of ice. I mean, there's nothing that makes any sense at all. But once you start watching it, kind of like, oh wow, I got to keep seeing this, even though it's almost like a mind meld. I mean, you can't.
Well, that's a good sort of way to bring this all back full circle, right?
No, that
doesn't make sense.
That makes one way more sense than me.
Oh yeah, really? Well, maybe that's a good recommendation.
There's a little bit of a plot. I mean, not a plot.
It's sort of connected to the X-Men universe, isn't it? Like,
I don't know.
You know what? The first season could maybe be something like that, but then when it morphs into this king, they're trying to find in these different bodies, and they're dragging the guy in this.
Yeah, but they came here for hours.
Yeah.
Well, that's okay.
I was just asking you because you watch. It seems like you're familiar with a lot of this kind of
Maybe they
bizarre stuff, but that's probably the most bizarre thing that's.
maybe they let the writers have free reign. You know?
yeah.
Pardon me?
Maybe they let maybe they allowed the writers to have like total free reign or something, and they. You know,
It's different.
Yeah, it is
Yeah.
based on a comic book.
Okay.
I don't know if the comic is that trippy.
Yeah.
It is. It's really. Yeah, it's kind of different.
Well, is there anything else that you guys want to say about Alice or Lewis Carroll or?
I have one quick
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
This is kind of off to the side, but I
Okay.
was really curious about this. And you said did you read through the formal logic book that he wrote?
Oh yeah, when I was an undergraduate, I worked through it.
Oh, okay, so you maybe can answer this question for me.
Yeah.
In a book by Robert Heinlein called The Number of the Beast, the
Oh, yeah.
characters at one point actually encounter Charles Dodgson, and they play a game with him called Sorties. And all of the moves in the game, like all of the things that they do in the game are spelled out, but they never explain the rules, and I never quite felt like I understood it. It's some kind of a logic game.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that?
Well, I mean, he's got the symbolic logic, and then he's got the game of logic, and it's been a long time since I've actually looked through all of this. A sorites is an argument it's like a long chain.
Right, you make all these different statements, and you're supposed to figure out what the statement being made by this statement. Well, that seemed to be what was going on, but I couldn't understand how exactly they related to each other.
Let me see. Let me take a very quick look in the. I don't know if he covers that. This part, the game of logic, it's in a way it's a misnomer, right? So he's got these diagrams. It's basically how you can do logical arguments. You can represent them and analyze them with these squares where you place counters and stuff like that. So it's not a game as such. But then where it gets fun is where he has like these long. They're not arguments as such. They're more like he gives you a bunch of statements. Like when you do those logic puzzles where it says, well, brown is sitting next to green, and green has a purple hat on, and you have to figure out what the conclusion is, right? Who's got the thimble, or whatever it happens to be. He will give you sometimes up to 20 different statements like that. And then as opposed to what we had, because we'd get those in math class, it was a extra credit thing, where it would say, well, who's got the thimble? He just says, what's the conclusion to draw? And I don't know if that's related to that game.
Yeah, I don't know. The game was definitely, they were making statements, and they were usually pretty outlandish sounding statements.
Yeah, well, that's typical of what he's doing there.
All the claims I make about sponges are false, or...
then we're getting to self-referential claims, right? And that makes it more complicated. As soon as you start referencing your own language, you introduce a new wrinkle into things. And
it was doing a lot of that.
When I was an undergraduate, I was a philosophy and mathematics major. And so for my senior thesis, I started examining batches of what we call truth self-referential statements, where you were, the most common and most basic one is, what I'm telling you is false, the liar's paradox, right? Or I am a liar. If I'm lying, well then it's true, but if it's true, then it's false, right? There's a paradox there.
Right.
And I managed to show, using mathematical functional modeling, that all truth self-referential statement groups could be boiled down to either the liar's paradox or just a tautology. And then, I'll tell you another funny story. So when I applied for graduate school, I had no idea what I was doing, because I was a first-generation college, and I knew I had to do a writing sample, and I realized that the senior thesis that I'd done about truth self-referential statement groups, which is requiring this mathematics and stuff like that you could actually model it with the Möbius strip. So there's a geometrical analog to that. So I wrote a little 5-page piece about that, and I sent it in as my writing sample. Now most people are sending in things like, well, Descartes, are we really in a dream or not, or human induction or stuff like that. And I talked with the chair, and he said, man, it's a good thing you had high test scores, because we couldn't figure out what the hell that thing that you submitted was. And I thought it was perfectly reasonable, but they were all like, what the hell is this crap,
It sounds like your logic used to make your charting garbage.
Yeah. And I just pictured to myself the committee, the admissions committee, looking at this, and some guy is talking about, well, in my senior thesis I demonstrated this, and they'd be like, okay, I get that so far. Now I'm going to come up with a geometrical modeling for it. What? Why the hell would you do that?
Well, I love too that they essentially looked at your test scores and went, well, I assume based on his test scores that this must make sense.
They were thinking too linearly. They just couldn't follow your train of thought.
You're just way past.
I don't know that they thought that it made sense. I think they were like, well, he's got high test scores, so we'll give him a chance.
They thought that relative, whether or not you were making sense, you were capable of making sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
The ideas are interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I was very fortunate. There's a lot of needles that I managed to somehow get through the thread where I could have easily bonked off and gone the other way. Right place, right time. Yeah. And it's unfortunate because that's not the case for most of the people who are trying to get into graduate studies today. It's much harder for them.